She leaned close enough that only I could hear and said, "You're not family." And I smiled because I did not know what else to do with my face. The word family stayed with me longer than her perfume, longer than the warmth of the room, longer than the sound of my own name being called from across the table. I smiled as if she had said something ordinary, as if she had asked me to pass the salt, and I remember thinking how practiced my body had become at pretending nothing hurt. My hands were folded in front of me, fingers resting where a ring used to be, and I kept them still because movement might have betrayed me. Around us, people were laughing softly, chairs scraping the floor, someone tapping a glass to make a point, and yet that single sentence seemed to land in a place where no one else could reach. I nodded once, slow and polite, the way I nod at strangers, and I felt something in my chest close gently, like a door being shut with care so it wouldn't make a sound. I stayed where I was. I did not step back. I did not step forward. I stood in the same spot and let the moment pass through me the way cold passes through old walls. I have learned that moments like that do not need an answer right away. They settle, they find their place. My smile felt stiff at the corners, but it held. It always holds. Someone touched my elbow and asked if I was all right, and I said yes without thinking, because yes is easier than explaining a feeling that has no sharp edges, only weight. I watched my daughter-in-law turn away, already done with me, already moving on to the next conversation, and I noticed how quickly she forgot the words she had just given me. For her, they were light. For me, they sank. I took my seat again and smoothed my skirt, the fabric familiar under my palms. This table had been in my home once. I remembered when we bought it, my husband and I, arguing gently about the finish, laughing about how heavy it was. Now it sat in a different house, under a different roof, and I was a guest at it, careful not to take up too much space. I listened as my son spoke about work, about plans, about things that required him to look forward. He sounded confident. He sounded grown. I tried to feel proud without feeling erased. Every so often his eyes flicked toward me and then away, like he was checking whether I was still there without needing to see me. I wondered if he had heard her words. I wondered if it mattered. Loneliness is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet agreement you make with yourself not to reach for things that no longer reach back. I had been practicing that for some time. The calls that came less often, the invitations that arrived late, if they arrived at all, the way decisions were made without me and then explained as if I had never been part of making decisions in the first place. I told myself this was how life was meant to go, that children move forward and parents learn to stand still. Still, there was a difference between standing still and being told you did not belong. One feels like time, the other feels like removal. I ate slowly, tasting very little. I watched the others more than I watched my plate. I noticed how my daughter-in-law corrected my son gently when he misspoke, how she finished his sentences when he hesitated. I noticed how comfortable she was in that role, how natural it seemed to her. I wondered if I had ever been that way with my husband, if I had once occupied the center of someone else's certainty without realizing it could be temporary. When someone asked me a question, I answered politely, briefly, careful not to say anything that would linger. I did not want to give them something to trip over later. When it was time for dessert, I stood to help out of habit, then paused, uncertain. My daughter-in-law was already in the kitchen, directing, arranging, deciding. I hesitated in the doorway, not quite in, not quite out, and she glanced at me with a look that was not unkind, but was firm, a look that said there was no need. I stepped back. I returned to my chair. The chair felt different then, less solid, as if it might disappear if I leaned too heavily into it. I folded my hands again and waited. Waiting has become one of my better skills. As the afternoon thinned and people began to leave, coats pulled from closets, goodbyes layered over each other, my son hugged me quickly, one arm, distracted. He said we would talk soon. Soon is a word that has learned how to stretch itself thin. I watched them through the window as I waited for my ride, their heads close together, their laughter private. I smiled again, though no one could see it now. Smiling has a momentum of its own. Once you start, it's hard to stop. On the drive home, the city passed by in familiar pieces. The bakery on the corner, the park where I once pushed a stroller, the light that always takes too long to change. Everything was still where it had been, which felt strange considering how easily a place can be taken away from you without anything moving at all. I rested my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead. I did not cry. Tears require a kind of certainty, and I was still sorting through what had happened. I told myself there would be time for understanding later. For now, there was only the quiet and the echo of a sentence that had not yet finished saying what it meant. After that day, nothing dramatic happened, which almost made it harder. Life continued in its careful way, one morning folding into the next, and I learned how easily a person can be left alone without being formally left at all. I waited for a call that did not come. I waited long enough that the waiting itself became a routine, like watering a plant you already know is dead. When I did speak to my son, it was brief and practical. He asked about my health. He mentioned the weather. He said work was busy. He did not ask how I was feeling, and I did not offer it. We have always shared a talent for avoiding the center of things. When the call ended, the quiet in my apartment felt deliberate, as if it had been instructed to stay. I began to notice how much of my day passed without my voice being used. I spoke to the cashier at the grocery store, to the woman in the elevator who commented on the heat, to myself when I misplaced my glasses. These conversations floated and vanished. They did not attach to anything. I told myself this was normal. At my age, you are expected to shrink your needs, to make yourself light enough that no one has to carry you. Still, I found myself setting 2 cups out of habit when I made tea, then correcting it with a small laugh that no one heard. I washed the extra cup and put it back, careful not to let the sink fill too high. Overflow has consequences. The invitation slowed, then stopped. Holidays were mentioned vaguely as something to be sorted out later. Later is another word that knows how to disappear. I did not press. Pressing has never served me well. Instead, I filled my time with tasks that could not reject me. I organized old papers. I wiped shelves that were already clean. I reread books I knew by heart because there were no surprises in them, and surprises had begun to feel unsafe. Every so often, I would think of that sentence again, the way it had been delivered without anger, without hesitation, and I would feel the same calm unease spread through me, like a bruise you only notice when you press on it. I wondered if she had always thought it, or if it was something that had formed over time, a conclusion reached quietly and then spoken aloud once it felt solid enough. I tried to replay our earlier conversations, looking for signs I might have missed. Had I said too much, too little? Had I stayed too long or not long enough? These questions did not accuse me. They simply occupied space. I answered them the way I answer most things now, by telling myself it was already done. The past does not ask permission before it settles in. When I saw my son again weeks later, it was by chance. I ran into him at the pharmacy, both of us reaching for the same bottle of vitamins. He looked surprised, then pleased, then slightly uncomfortable, all within the span of a few seconds. We spoke there, between the aisles, our voices low, as if we were discussing something private instead of nothing at all. He asked if I was eating well. I asked if he was sleeping enough. We smiled at each other, the familiar shape of our faces doing old work. He mentioned his wife in passing, something about a trip they were planning. I nodded and said it sounded nice. I did not mention the last time we were all together. He did not either. Some topics arranged themselves neatly on a shelf marked fragile. As we parted, he said we should get together soon. I said yes. Yes comes easily to me, it always has. On the walk home, I felt the faint stirring of hope, which surprised me. Hope is stubborn. It shows up even when you have not invited it. I tried not to encourage it. I told myself that chance encounters are not promises. Still, that evening I cooked a full meal instead of something simple, as if preparing for an arrival that might sense my effort and appear. The food tasted fine. I ate alone. I packed the leftovers carefully and placed them in the refrigerator, labeling them with a date because dates help things feel accounted for. I began to sense a subtle shift in how I was seen, even when I was not present. Decisions were being made around me instead of with me. I heard about changes after they had already happened, a move, a purchase, a plan. Each time, the information was offered casually, like an afterthought, and I accepted it that way. Acceptance has a way of looking like agreement if you do not examine it too closely. I told myself that this was what independence looked like now, that my role had simply changed shape. Yet in quiet moments, I felt the outline of something missing, the way you can feel the absence of a tooth with your tongue long after it's gone. One afternoon, a message arrived from my daughter-in-law, polite and brief. She thanked me for something small I had done weeks earlier, something I barely remembered. The message ended without warmth or invitation. I stared at it longer than necessary, reading into the spaces between the words. I typed a response, then erased it, then typed another. In the end, I sent a simple acknowledgement. "Thank you for letting me know." The sentence sat there, correct and distant. I put the phone down and sat with my hands in my lap, waiting for a feeling to arrive that did not come. That night, I dreamed of a house I no longer recognized, rooms rearranged, doors leading to unexpected places. I woke before morning, the dream clinging to me like a damp sheet. I lay there listening to the building settle, the pipes ticking softly, and I thought about belonging, how easily it can be reassigned without notice. I did not feel angry. Anger requires energy. What I felt instead was a quiet alertness, the sense that something was moving beneath the surface of things, something unfinished. I turned onto my side and waited for sleep to return, knowing it might not, knowing that waiting, once again, was what I was best prepared to do. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped halfway through my mail slot, like it wasn't sure I would want it. I stood over it longer than necessary, looking at my name written in careful ink, the letters slightly slanted, unfamiliar but deliberate. I did not pick it up right away. I let it rest there among the flyers and utility notices, as if it needed time to decide whether it truly belonged to me. When I finally opened it, the paper was thick, textured, the kind that announces importance before you read a single word. My son was getting married, properly this time, with ceremony and guests and a venue that required directions. I had known, of course. People had mentioned it in passing, as if it were a date on a shared calendar I had simply forgotten to check. Still, seeing it written down made it real in a way I was not prepared for. I sat at the small kitchen table and read the invitation twice, then a third time, slower. My name was there, no +1, no personal note, just the facts, neatly arranged. For a moment, something warm moved through me, cautious but undeniable. I told myself this was a step forward, that perhaps the distance I had felt was not intentional but circumstantial, the result of busy lives and misaligned schedules. I reminded myself that weddings are complicated, that there is always tension, always someone who feels overlooked. I folded the invitation carefully and placed it beside my teacup, aligning the edges the way I used to align my son's school papers when he was young. Order has always calmed me. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about the wedding more than I intended to. I imagined the room, the music, the way my son might look standing at the front, waiting. I tried to picture myself there without feeling like an intruder. I practiced neutral expressions in the mirror, the kind that convey happiness without expectation. I chose a dress I already owned, something understated, something that would not draw attention. I did not want to be noticed. I only wanted to be present. There is a difference, though it took me years to learn it. When I RSVP'd, I wrote a short note congratulating them, nothing that required a response. I mailed it the same day, standing at the mailbox longer than usual, my hand resting on the metal as if to feel the letter leave me. After that, there was silence again. No acknowledgement, no follow-up. I told myself that was normal too. Brides are busy, sons forget things, mothers adjust. Adjustment has been my lifelong skill. The day of the wedding arrived bright and unyielding, the kind of day that insists on being remembered. I arrived early because arriving late would have felt like another kind of absence. The venue was beautiful in a polished way, all clean lines and deliberate softness. I took my seat where I was directed, several rows back, close enough to see but far enough not to be involved. People around me spoke in low, excited voices, leaning toward each other, sharing histories I was not part of. I sat with my hands folded, my purse on my lap, and waited. Waiting felt appropriate. When my son appeared, my chest tightened in a way I had not expected. He looked older than I remembered, steadier somehow. He did not look toward me. I told myself he was focused. I told myself many things. When the ceremony began, I listened carefully, absorbing each word as if it were being spoken only once, because perhaps it was. The vows were earnest. The audience murmured approval at the right moments. I smiled when others smiled. I felt almost normal. Afterward, during the reception, the room shifted. People stood and moved and found their places again. I followed the flow without leading it. When it came time for speeches, I felt a small tightening, a question forming quietly. I wondered if there would be a mention, a nod, some acknowledgement of where he had come from. When his wife spoke, her words were confident and practiced. She thanked her parents, she thanked friends, she spoke about beginnings. She did not look at me. When my son spoke, he echoed her thanks, his voice steady. He spoke about support, about love, about the future. He did not look at me either. I felt something then, not sharp, not sudden, but definitive. It was the feeling of being placed somewhere without being asked. I stayed still. I listened. When the applause came, I joined it, my hands meeting softly, carefully, as if I were applauding from behind glass. I told myself this was not a slight. I told myself that weddings are not about parents. I told myself that I had raised him to stand on his own, and this was what that looked like. Still, my throat felt tight, and I sipped my water slowly to keep it from showing. Later, as people mingled, my daughter-in-law approached me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She thanked me for coming, for understanding how busy things had been. Her words were polite, controlled. I congratulated her. I told her she looked beautiful. That part was true. She paused, as if considering something, then leaned in slightly and said something about seating arrangements, about how complicated it all was, how some people just didn't fit neatly into the picture. Her voice was light. Her meaning was not. I nodded. I said I understood. Understanding has many uses. As the evening wore on, I felt myself receding, not physically but perceptually, like an object gradually losing focus. I was there, but increasingly irrelevant. I watched from the edges, careful not to interrupt, careful not to impose. At one point, I caught my reflection in a mirrored column and barely recognized myself. I looked composed. I looked appropriate. I looked like someone who knew her place. When I finally left, slipping out without drawing attention, the air outside felt cooler, more honest. I stood for a moment listening to the music muffled behind the doors, and I realized that something had shifted again, something quiet but irrevocable. I had come with hope tucked carefully into my bag. I was leaving without it. As I walked toward the parking lot, my phone vibrated once in my hand, a message arriving at the exact wrong moment, and I did not look at it because I already knew that whatever it said would ask something of me I was no longer sure I could give. I read the message the next morning when the light was thin and honest and there was nowhere for meaning to hide. It was from my daughter-in-law, brief and composed, thanking me again for attending and mentioning that there had been some confusion the night before, something about expectations and boundaries, phrased as if it were a scheduling issue. She hoped I understood. I read it twice, then set the phone down beside my plate. My breakfast went cold while I watched a bird on the railing outside my window peck at nothing in particular. I thought about how often understanding is requested after the fact, once there is nothing left to adjust. I replied later with a single sentence, telling her I wished them well. It was the kind of sentence that closes itself. In the weeks that followed, I felt a strange lightness paired with a deeper ache, as if something heavy had been lifted but left an imprint behind. The wedding photos began to appear online, carefully curated, bright with smiles and movement. I recognized faces, I recognized places. I did not recognize myself. In one photograph, I was visible in the background, partially obscured by a centerpiece, my expression neutral, my hands folded. I studied that image longer than I should have. I looked like someone waiting for instructions that never came. I closed the page and did not open it again. When my son called, it was to ask about a document he needed, something related to his childhood, a record I had kept. He spoke politely, efficiently, as if we were colleagues sorting through old files. I found the paper while he waited on the line, the sound of his breathing steady and distant. When I handed it over later that week, meeting him briefly outside his office, he thanked me and said we should have lunch sometime. I smiled and said that would be nice. We did not set a date. Dates require intention. It was during that lunchless period that the public moment happened, the one that would settle itself into me in a way nothing else had. We were at a small gathering, casual, unremarkable, the kind of thing that exists only to fill an afternoon. I had been invited late, included as an afterthought that still counts as inclusion if you don't examine it closely. I arrived with a small gift and an even smaller expectation. Conversation drifted. People spoke over one another. At some point, a question arose about family, about who belonged to whom, about traditions. I did not speak. I rarely do in those moments. My daughter-in-law answered for us, her voice clear, untroubled, explaining the structure of things as she saw them. Then she turned slightly, not enough to face me, and said it again, that I was not family. Said it like a clarification, like something that needed to be stated so everyone could move on. There was a pause, brief but perceptible. Someone laughed awkwardly, someone else changed the subject. I smiled. I smiled because my body recognized the instruction before my mind did. I smiled because the alternative would have required space I was no longer allowed to take. I felt my son stiffen beside her, felt the moment register and then be deliberately set aside. No one challenged it, no one needed to. Words like that do not require agreement to do their work. Afterward, as I drove home alone, the roads familiar and forgiving, I noticed how steady my hands were on the wheel. I was not shaking, I was not crying. I was aware, sharply, of how calm I felt, and that calm frightened me more than anger ever could. Calm suggests acceptance. Acceptance can look too much like permission if you are not careful. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and did not look away. My face held no accusation, it held no plea. It looked older than it had the day before, not in years, but in clarity. At home, I placed the gift I had brought back onto the counter, unopened. I did not feel embarrassed. Embarrassment requires the belief that something could have gone differently if you had behaved better. I did not believe that anymore. I sat down and let the quiet return, the kind of quiet that waits patiently, confident it will be noticed. I thought about the word family, how it had been defined for me my entire life by what I gave rather than what I received. I thought about how definitions can be revised without consultation. The days after that blurred slightly, not because they were painful, but because they were deliberate. I began to notice patterns I had previously dismissed, the way my contributions were acknowledged only after they were complete, the way my presence was tolerated but not required, the way my absence went unremarked. These were not new developments, they were simply clearer now, stripped of the hope that had softened them before. Clarity has a way of arriving quietly and staying. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer I had not opened in years, I came across old correspondence, letters written in a careful hand, documents folded and refolded. I sat on the floor and went through them slowly, not with nostalgia but with attention. I realized how much of my life had been spent maintaining continuity for others, how many transitions I had smoothed, how often I had stepped back so someone else could step forward without noticing the space I left behind. I did not feel resentful. Resentment requires an expectation of fairness. What I felt instead was a growing sense of precision, like a lens being adjusted. I began to speak less and observe more. I noticed who asked questions and who only answered them. I noticed whose comfort was prioritized and whose was assumed. I noticed how easily people accept arrangements that benefit them. These observations did not make me sad, they made me attentive. Attention is a form of care you can give yourself when no one else is offering it. When my daughter-in-law sent another message, this one about an upcoming holiday and how plans were still uncertain, I read it carefully and did not respond right away. I placed the phone face down and watched the light shift across the room. I understood then that whatever had been taken from me could not be returned by explanation or apology. It would require something else entirely, something quiet and exact. I did not know yet what that would look like. I only knew that the smile I had worn in public was no longer available to me in private, and that whatever came next would need to be faced without it. After that, I entered a period of quiet that felt different from the ones before. It was not empty, it was deliberate. I stopped waiting for calls and began letting the phone rest where it was. I stopped checking dates against calendars that did not include me. Instead, I allowed my days to take their own shape, unhurried and observant. I woke early, not because I had somewhere to be, but because I wanted to see the morning arrive without interruption. There is something instructive about watching light fill a room slowly. It does not ask permission, it does not explain itself, it simply arrives and rearranges what it touches. I did not confront anyone. I did not announce any decisions. Silence, I found, carried more information than speech ever had. When my son called, which happened less frequently now, I answered warmly and briefly. I asked after his work. I listened when he spoke. I did not volunteer details about my own life. This was not punishment, it was adjustment. I was learning what to keep for myself. Each conversation ended politely, smoothly, like a door closing without a click. When he mentioned his wife, I responded kindly. I had no interest in competing for space I no longer wanted to occupy. I began to notice how much energy had been freed up by no longer performing reassurance. My thoughts felt clearer, my movements felt more intentional. I sorted through closets and drawers with a patience I had not known before, discarding what no longer served a purpose. Objects tell stories if you let them. Some reminded me of years when my role had been unquestioned, others of promises that had quietly expired. I kept very little. Letting go did not feel like loss. It felt like accuracy. During this time, I made no visible changes. I did not sell anything. I did not announce plans. From the outside, I imagine I looked exactly the same. That was important to me. Visibility can invite interference. I preferred to work unnoticed. I read more than usual, not novels, but things that required attention, things written in precise language. I took notes in the margins, not because I needed to remember, but because writing something down made it real in a way thinking alone did not. I paid attention to phrasing, to how meaning is shaped by what is included and what is left unsaid. Occasionally, my daughter-in-law reached out, always politely, always with a purpose, a question about an old recipe, a clarification about a family date. Each message was careful, contained. I responded in kind, short answers, no commentary. I sensed her recalibrating, testing boundaries she had already drawn. I did not push back, I simply stayed where I was. There is a power in not moving towards someone who expects you to. It changes the geometry of the room. I began walking more, choosing routes that took me past buildings I had known for decades. Places hold memory without insisting on it. As I walked, I thought about the years I had spent smoothing paths for others, making things easier without being asked, believing that usefulness was the same as belonging. I saw now that usefulness expires the moment it is no longer needed. Belonging, if it exists at all, does not. This was not a bitter realization. It was a clean one. Clean things hurt less. One afternoon, I stopped by my bank, something I had not done in person for some time. The lobby smelled faintly of polish and paper. I waited my turn and spoke with a young woman whose name I did not catch. She was polite, efficient. I asked questions, she answered them. There was nothing remarkable about the exchange, and yet I left feeling steadier, as if I had confirmed the location of something important. I did not tell anyone about this visit. Some steps are meant to be taken quietly. At home, I resumed my routines with a slightly altered awareness. I cooked for myself with care, setting the table even when I was alone. I ate slowly. I slept better than I had in months. At night, I sometimes lay awake, thinking not about what had been said to me, but about what had been assumed. Assumptions have weight. They shape behavior long before they are spoken aloud. I wondered how many decisions had been made with the confidence that I would adapt, accommodate, accept. I wondered what would happen if I did not. When the holiday my daughter-in-law had mentioned approached, I received another message outlining tentative plans. The wording suggested flexibility, but the meaning was clear. I was being informed, not invited. I read it carefully and replied that I would not be attending. I offered no explanation. The message sat there after I sent it, simple and complete. The response came later, expressing surprise, then understanding again. I turned the phone off and went for a walk. As the days shortened, I felt a growing sense of alignment, as if my inner life and outer behavior were finally matching. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel wounded. I felt prepared, though for what I could not yet have said. Preparation is often mistaken for planning. It is not the same. Planning looks forward. Preparation steadies you where you are. I noticed a subtle shift in how I was addressed when we did speak. There was a new caution, a slight hesitancy. Absence changes dynamics. Silence creates space people are not always comfortable with. I did not fill that space. I let it remain open, unresolved. In that openness, I felt something gathering, not anger, not revenge, but clarity waiting for its moment. I did not rush it. Moments like that do not respond well to being summoned. They arrive when everything else has been put in order, and not before. By then, my days had taken on a quiet steadiness that surprised me. I woke without the small jolt of expectation that used to greet me, the sense that I might be needed, summoned, corrected. Instead, I moved through the hours with a kind of measured attention, doing what needed to be done because it was mine to do, not because anyone was watching. I kept my apartment orderly, but not immaculate. Perfection invites inspection. I preferred things to look lived in, accurate. When something broke, I fixed it or replaced it without consulting anyone. That, too, felt new. I began to notice how rarely I was asked for my opinion now, and how little that bothered me. Opinions, once offered, can be reshaped by others. Kept private, they retain their original edges. I listened more than I spoke when I was around them, which was less often than before. When my son mentioned something he and his wife were considering, I nodded and said it sounded reasonable. Reasonable is a word that closes conversations politely. I did not argue, I did not advise, I let them assume what they wished about my acquiescence. Assumptions, I had learned, are often the most efficient tools people use on themselves. There were small tasks I undertook without ceremony. Papers were reviewed, old files were reread, names and dates aligned themselves in my mind with a clarity that had been dulled for years by distraction. I found comfort in precision. I wrote things down and then wrote them again, refining language until it said exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. I did not hurry. Haste creates noise. I wanted quiet. Occasionally, I sensed a shift in tone when my daughter-in-law spoke to me, a carefulness that had not been there before. She asked neutral questions. She offered information without invitation. It was as if she were testing the floor for weak spots, listening for hollow sounds. I gave her none. I responded with politeness and restraint, never offering more than was asked for. There is a particular balance to be struck between warmth and distance. I had not mastered it before. I was learning now. I spent time thinking about ownership, not in the material sense alone, but in the way people come to believe they own narratives, histories, even relationships. Ownership can be quiet. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply assumes permanence. I wondered how many things in my life had been treated as permanent that were, in fact, provisional. The thought did not upset me. It clarified me. One afternoon, I met an old acquaintance for tea, someone who had known me before I was anyone's mother-in-law, before my role had acquired conditions. We spoke about ordinary things, our voices easy. She remarked that I seemed lighter. I considered this and said nothing. Lightness can be misleading. It can be mistaken for weakness when it is actually the result of shedding unnecessary weight. As we parted, she squeezed my hand and said it was good to see me. I believed her. Belief, I realized, comes more easily when it is not begged for. At home that evening, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights come on, one by one, each illuminating a small circle before yielding to the next. I thought about visibility, about what it means to be seen and by whom. There had been a time when I believed visibility was a form of security, that being included meant being protected. Now I understood that visibility can make you vulnerable to other people's revisions. There are advantages to stepping just out of frame. My son called later that week, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty I had not heard before. He asked if everything was all right. The question hovered between concern and obligation. I told him I was fine. I asked about his work. He answered, then paused as if waiting for me to say more. I did not. Silence stretched, then he filled it with assurances, with plans spoken in general terms. I listened. When the call ended, I felt no urge to call back. That absence of urgency felt like progress. I took a short trip on my own, nothing elaborate, just a change of scenery. I walked unfamiliar streets, ate meals alone in quiet places, listened to conversations that had nothing to do with me. There is relief in anonymity. No one there knew my history. No one expected anything from me. I returned home rested, carrying a sense of having reclaimed a small, important territory inside myself. As the season shifted, I noticed how carefully I was being handled. Invitations, when they came, were phrased with options, as if to accommodate my preferences. Questions were asked that had not been asked before. It was subtle, but it was there. I did not respond by becoming more available. I remained consistent. Consistency, I had learned, is more unsettling than refusal. It suggests intention. One evening, as I sat at my table reviewing something I had written earlier, I felt a brief flicker of doubt. Doubt is a companion that shows up when things are about to change. I acknowledged it and continued. The words on the page did not change in response to my hesitation. They remained as they were, precise and calm. I folded the paper and placed it where it belonged. Not everything needs to be accessible at all times. Before bed, I checked my phone and saw a message waiting, something about a meeting, a question posed indirectly. I did not open it. I set the phone down and turned off the light. In the dark, I felt the steady presence of what I had put in motion, not as a plan, not as an act of defiance, but as a correction long overdue. I slept deeply that night, aware that the next steps would not announce themselves loudly, and that when they came, they would ask nothing from me except that I remain exactly where I was. The meeting happened on a gray morning, the kind that flattens color and makes everything feel provisional. I arrived early and sat where I was told, hands folded, purse at my feet. My son and his wife arrived together, slightly late, apologetic in the way people are when they assume forgiveness will be automatic. She smiled at me, cautious, the way you smile at someone whose reactions you can no longer predict. He asked if I was all right. I said yes, it was true. We waited a few minutes more. Then a man entered carrying a folder that looked heavier than it needed to be. He introduced himself and sat down. The room was quiet enough to hear the clock mark each second without urgency. He began by explaining why we were there, using language that was careful and exact. There had been assumptions, he said, about ownership and access. There had been misunderstandings about what would happen eventually. Eventually is a word people lean on when they do not intend to be present. He spoke without accusation, which I appreciated. Accusations invite defense. Facts simply stand where they are placed. He opened the folder and laid out documents, each one aligned neatly, as if order itself were a kind of courtesy. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. My son frowned, reading as he listened, his expression shifting from mild confusion to something tighter. The man explained that the apartment I lived in was not, as they believed, something that would automatically pass to them. It had never been structured that way. Years ago, choices had been made, paperwork filed, contingencies arranged. At the time, no one had asked about them, and I had not volunteered the information. I had been told it would all sort itself out. It had, just not in the way they expected. He went on, calmly, outlining the details, the trust, the stipulations, the conditions under which decisions could be made and by whom. He used my name frequently, respectfully, anchoring each point to me rather than around me. I listened, nodding occasionally, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted him to know I was present. My daughter-in-law asked a question, her voice measured, about timing, about intent. He answered her directly. Intent, he said, was not a matter of interpretation when it had been written down so clearly. My son looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time in a long while. His face held surprise, then something like recalibration. He asked why I had not said anything sooner. The question was not accusational, it was bewildered. I considered my answer carefully before I spoke. I told him there had never been a reason to. The words felt light when I said them, accurate without being sharp. The man closed the folder gently, signaling that the essential information had been delivered. Silence settled over the table. It was not hostile, it was thoughtful. I felt no triumph. Triumph requires an opponent. What I felt instead was relief, the quiet kind that arrives when something long misread is finally read correctly. My daughter-in-law sat back, her expression composed but altered, as if a familiar room had been rearranged while she was away. She nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. She did not look at me. That, too, was information. My daughter-in-law sent a message some weeks later, carefully worded, suggesting lunch. I read it without urgency. I did not feel offended. I did not feel flattered. I felt neutral, which told me everything I needed to know. I replied politely and declined, citing other plans. The plans were simple and private, and they mattered to me more than restoring a shape that had never fit. She responded with understanding. Understanding again. I did not examine the word too closely this time. There was no confrontation, no final speech, no scene where everything was laid bare and acknowledged. Life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What it offers instead are small, consistent confirmations that you have chosen correctly. I found those confirmations in the ease of my mornings, in the way my shoulders no longer tensed when the phone rang, in the absence of rehearsed explanations. I had stopped preparing myself to be diminished. One afternoon, I returned to that photograph from the wedding, the one where I was barely visible behind the centerpiece. I looked at it again, not with sadness, but with curiosity. I recognized the woman there, the careful posture, the contained expression. I felt no urge to correct the image or replace it. That woman had done what she needed to do to survive a moment that was not designed for her. I closed the page and felt a quiet gratitude for her restraint. It had carried me further than anger ever could have. As time passed, the story others told themselves adjusted. I was spoken of with more caution, sometimes with respect, sometimes with confusion. I did not correct any of it. People are entitled to their interpretations. I was no longer interested in managing them. When I was included, it was deliberate. When I was not, it was honest. Both were acceptable. What mattered was that I no longer mistook tolerance for belonging. I spent more time with people who met me where I was, without requiring me to shrink or soften. These relationships were not dramatic. They did not announce their importance. They simply endured, steady and reciprocal. I found that I laughed more easily now, not because things were amusing, but because I was relaxed enough to notice them. Laughter, I realized, does not thrive in vigilance. My son and I settled into a rhythm that was quieter than before, but more sincere. He no longer assumed my availability. I no longer offered it reflexively. When we did spend time together, it was intentional, bounded, respectful. We spoke honestly, if not deeply. Depth, I had learned, cannot be demanded. It arrives when conditions allow. If it never did, that would be all right too. I had stopped measuring our relationship against an ideal that no longer applied. There was no reconciliation with my daughter-in-law, only distance that felt appropriate rather than punitive. She maintained her boundaries, I maintained mine. We interacted when necessary, civil and contained. I did not seek her approval. She did not seek my counsel. The arrangement worked because it asked nothing extra of either of us. Peace, I discovered, is often the result of lowered expectations. On a quiet evening, months later, I sat in my living room with the windows open, listening to the sounds of other people living their lives. Somewhere nearby, someone was practicing the piano, haltingly, repeating the same passage until it improved. I thought about effort, about how it looks different when it is finally directed inward. I felt no regret. Regret implies a desire to return. I did not want to return. I wanted to remain. I thought again of the moment when she had said those words in public, the way my smile had held while something inside me folded. I understood now that what folded had not broken, it had simply stepped aside, making room for something sturdier. That smile had not been weakness, it had been timing. Timing matters more than force. As night settled, I turned off the lights one by one, moving through my space with familiarity and ease. This was my home, not because of documents or protections, but because I inhabited it fully, without apology. I felt a quiet satisfaction in that knowledge, not triumphant, not loud, just settled. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. There were no new messages. That, too, felt right. I placed it on the table and lay down, my body relaxed in a way it had not been in years. I did not think about what might happen next. I did not rehearse conversations. I allowed the day to end without commentary. In the dark, I smiled, not out of habit this time, but because the smile belonged to me alone. It did not need to protect anything. It did not need to signal compliance or endurance. It was simply the expression of a woman who knew where she stood and who no longer needed anyone else to tell her whether she belonged.